We have the Taylor James Johnatakis sentencing. Today, the court sentenced Taylor James Johnatakis. This court ordered that Mr. Johnatakis be committed to the custody of the Bureau of Prisons for a term of 87 months. And they have some notes here that I'm just going to briefly go through, because a lot of it you've all heard before. But what the jury found Mr. Johnatakis to have done on January 6th was neither First Amendment protected activity nor civil disobedience. As the court has said before, the First Amendment does not give anyone the right to enter a restricted building or to engage in riotous activity in the Capitol. It obviously does not give anyone the right to assault the police, nor was January 6th riot an act of civil disobedience because it was violent, not peaceful, opportunistic, not principled, coercive, not persuasive, and selfish, not patriotic. The portrayal of Mr. Johnatakis as either a peaceful protester or someone simply swept up by the crowd does not match the reality established at trial. One thing that strikes me about the letters is that few of the officers seem to know what he actually did. Now, if you haven't looked at the letters, at least one of them flat out admits that they researched it using ChatGPT. One person even wrote me that they know he has never done anything violent and never would. Perhaps Mr. Johnatakis has contributed to this misperception, because though he repeatedly expressed his heartfelt and sincere regrets at trial, since his conviction he has denied his conduct and downplayed the January 6th riot itself. But the court knows the facts of this case because it has heard from the witnesses and examined the evidence, including police body camera footage and videos filmed by Mr. Johnatakis himself. The court would therefore like to set the record straight about what Mr. Johnatakis did that day. In any angry mob, there are leaders and there are followers. Mr. Johnatakis was a leader. He knew what he was doing that day. On January 5th, he posted on social media, "Burn the city down. What the British did to DC will be nothing." The next day, while marching to the Capitol, he recorded and posted a video in which he exclaimed, "We're walking over to the Capitol right now. I don't know. Maybe we'll break down the doors." Pre-sentence report. It was in there. Once he got to the restricted grounds of the Capitol, he made his way to the vanguard of the crowd, all while yelling into the megaphone he had brought with him. As Metropolitan Police Department Captain David Augustine testified at trial, rioters eventually overwhelmed the police line and forced the officers to retreat to the Capitol's southwest steps under the scaffolding created for inauguration. The video played at trial shows that Mr. Johnatakis led the charge up the stairs. He soon reached a fallback line of barricades manned by police in order to protect the Capitol building itself and the members of the Congress, staff, and others inside. When he got there, he waved on more people toward the police line and through his megaphone barked commands to pack it in. So, although one of the letters claims that Mr. Johnatakis set out with good intentions and ended up in a crowd of orchestrated, out-of-control protesters, in fact, it was Mr. Johnatakis himself who organized protesters to violence that day. Once enough protesters had heeded his calls and swarmed against the police line, Mr. Johnatakis deployed his megaphone to give encouragement, step-by-step instructions for overpowering the police. As he announced 1, 2, 3, go, he and his fellow rioters, including the co-defendants Craig Bingert and Isaac Sturgeon, picked up the metal barricades and slammed them into the police officers. Mr. Johnatakis and the others then raised the barriers high until they were about head level with the officers so that the mob could brawl with the officers without the barricades getting in the way. And the resulting melee, Mr. Johnatakis seized MPD officer Juan Gonzalez by the arm. Officer Zongales testified at trial that with Mr. Johnatakis holding his arm in place, he was unable to hold back the line of rioters to protect himself. By effectively disarming Officer Gonzalez, Mr. Johnatakis made him vulnerable to serious injury or worse. Indeed, Officer Gonzalez said that during the assault, he felt like he had suffered a serious injury and perhaps even broke his leg. Another officer was standing alongside the officer. Officer Mark de Avignon thought he was going to die. As Mr. Johnatakis walked away from the Capitol, he recorded several videos in which he expressed his satisfaction with what had occurred and pride in the role he had played. He crowed that for the first time since 1817, the Capitol was stormed and that members of Congress were forced to evacuate. He boasted that the crowd was so irate that we probably would have murdered a few of the members of Congress had we seen exactly who they were. He said of his conduct, "I was on the front line, I was on the gate, I organized a push-up to the Capitol because I felt like that is exactly what we needed." He also claimed that it was 1776 again, as if he were fighting for freedom against a foreign oppressor rather than battling his own elected representative government. As the court said before, on January 6th, a mob invaded, occupied the United States Capitol, using force to interrupt the peaceful transfer of power mandated by the Constitution and our Republican heritage. And as we continue down, there's more. Because it didn't stop on January 6th for this guy, right? Let me find it here. The court would also like to address Mr. Johnatakis' conduct since the jury convicted him. At trial, he repeatedly expressed contrition to the court and the jury, but he changes his story depending on his audience. Since conviction, he has frequently offered public commentary about his actions on January 6th, including by issuing letters and giving speeches and podcast interviews from jail. The D.C. jail and the United States Marshal Service have reported to me that to give interviews, he purposely bypassed the D.C. jail's safeguard. When the jail blocked him from calling into a podcast directly, rather than consult the jail's authorities to see if such an interview would be permitted, he devised a workaround to reach the podcast host. It has come to the attention of the court that this particular podcast episode was ultimately published on YouTube on January 9th, 2024, and it was the DC Gulag and NYC Tunnels featuring Taylor James Johnatakis. How would the court ever find that, you know? Mr. Johnatakis' message was, we did nothing, we touched a gate, we got pepper sprayed, we moved back, that was it. He also said that everything about January 6th is just overblown. Similarly, in January 12, 2023 letter, he explained his actions by saying, I chose to get rowdy but not violent. At the time, I thought it was a right born of necessity. These comments suggest that Mr. Johnatakis sought to mislead the court and the jury when he repeatedly expressed his contrition for his actions on January 6th, for instance, by asking witnesses to please accept my sincere apology for my role in the events of that day. Moreover, these remarks leave no doubt that Mr. Johnatakis, unlike many January 6th defendants sentenced by the court, does not accept responsibility for his actions and does not show true remorse. Indeed, he did not do so today. Although his speech itself is protected, a person who violates the rules of his confinement through subterfuge nonetheless does not demonstrate that the court should depart from the guidelines for the offenses, or even give him a low end of the guidelines. This subterfuge recalls his brazen attempts to abuse the trial process by making improper comments to the jury. Before the trial began, the court went to great pains to remind Mr. Johnatakis that in exercising his constitutional right to self-representation, he would be expected to adhere to the same rules, the same procedures, and the same substantive law as any other defendant. The court specifically advised him that if he was unsure whether a particular argument is appropriate for the jury, he should either consult with his standby counsel or speak to me outside of earshot of the jury. In response, Mr. Johnatakis said that he accepted the court's statement. For most of the trial, Mr. Johnatakis was courteous and respectful to the court, but as soon as he began his closing arguments, he started telling the jury facts not in the record. He was effectively trying to testify without being subject to cross-examination. Then, he tried to argue for jury nullification. After the court shut down both attempts, it required Mr. Johnatakis to read the court what he prepared to say next to the jury. Yet, as soon as the court approved his remarks, he began making further improper remarks that he had not cleared with the court. His efforts to subvert the judicial process through various unorthodox means, combined with his lack of remorse, made me worry that if given the chance, he will again engage in violent criminal activity. Finally, the court would like to address the insights into Mr. Johnatakis' character offered by his letters of support. One factor the court considers in every sentencing is the history and characteristics of the defendant. The court is grateful that so many people took the time to submit thoughtful letters in support of the defendant. The court respects their views of Mr. Johnatakis. I read every letter and took into account their comments about the good quality they exhibit over a lifetime. Yet our system of justice, we punish people not on their overall character, but for their actions. Living in an otherwise blameless life does not grant anyone a free pass. Mr. Johnatakis is not here today because of who he is, but to be accountable for what he did. Yeah, it's not going well for him. Like the jury, I listened to the witnesses and examined the evidence of his actions on January 6th. Having done so, the court concludes that unfortunately for him, his friends, his family, and our society, it seems Mr. Johnatakis left his good qualities at home when he went to the Capitol on January 6th. The actions of Mr. Johnatakis are inexcusable, and his choices have consequences. The court takes no pleasure in sending any defendant to prison, but will not shirk its solemn duty to enforce law and order. So that Mr. Johnatakis, friends, and family can understand the sentence imposed today, the court will order the clerk of court to send a copy of these remarks to each person who submitted a letter on behalf of Mr. Johnatakis. I am pleased that some of his family can be here today to hear my words. I will decline to vary or depart upwards from the sentencing guidelines, and I will impose a guideline sentence in this case. 87 months. And they mentioned him calling out on the podcast when he wasn't allowed. This does make me wonder if the calls to the corner are allowed or not. They certainly don't help any J6 defendant.